And so today we have Cameron Copeland. Dr. Cameron Copeland is an assistant professor in the Department of African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University. And Dr. Copeland was previously a postdoctoral fellow in the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University before taking his new role. He received his PhD in cinema and media studies from the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts in August of 23. He is working currently on a book project titled Muhammad Ghazi's Islam, Blackness, and Resistance Cinema in the United States. So today, we'll focus on a portion of that research and share with us his findings. That is exploring Islam, Blackness, and Resistance Cinema in Chicagoland. Our discussant today is Michelle Gordon. Dr. Michelle Gordon is an associate professor of teaching and director of undergraduate studies in the Department of African American Studies at Emory University. And she works in the areas of Black studies, American literature, and cultural studies, with particular interest in relationships and intersections among creative expression, freedom struggles, and memory. Her scholarship has appeared in such journals as African American Review and American Quarterly, and she continues to explore the radical local literary and arts histories.
So I would like to thank Allison, Sumaya, Michelle, and everyone at the BMRC. This was a very impactful time for me, very personally fulfilling, but also scholarly enriching. I'd also like to thank all of the staff at the collections I visited. I visited the Chicago History Museum, the Newberry Library, the Harsh Collection at the Carter G. Woodson Library, the Harold Washington Library, Transportation Library at Northwestern, Special Collection at DePaul, and the Women in Leadership Archives at Loyola. So I really learned a whole bunch. So this presentation focuses on my findings in the archives throughout Black Chicago for my book project, Muhammad Ghazi's Islam, Blackness, and Resistance Cinema in the United States. So in addition to functioning as like a representational history of U.S. Black American Muslims in cinema, I also look at how Muslims used like more accessible forms of film technology like home video, which I'll be discussing today, public access TV, public affairs TV, independent film, among other forms of film technology. So building upon Gil Deleuze's discussion of cinema as, quote, the organ for perfecting the new reality, unquote, film theorist Kara Keeling characterizes the cinematic as being initiated with the introduction of film technology and thus analyzes various forms of the moving image like film and TV under the rubric of cinema to challenge dominant representations of race, class, and gender. So expanding upon this framework in my work, I refer to various forms of film technology that Black Muslims deployed to create counter narratives to mainstream representation as quote unquote resistance cinema. So this is really the way I deploy this term and the way I will deploy it in this talk today. So my trip to Chicago really began at the Film Studies Center at the University of Chicago. And there I was conducting research on a film movement called the LA Rebellion film movement as I'm drafting an article on like the representation and really influence of Islam in this movement. However, the majority of my research in Chicago was centered on a chapter of my book project that really explores the use of home video in the late 70s and early 90s by a grassroots street organization referred to as El Rukin. So El Rukin was formerly known as the Black Stone Rangers prior to embracing Islam in the late 1970s. So I argue that the Alrukins engaged in liberatory filmmaking practices by producing home videos, as you see in these stills that resisted dominant representations of Black Muslims and revolutionaries in the mainstream media. So in these home videos, you can see Black Muslim men, women, and children wearing attire associated with the Moorish Science Temple, which was a movement founded in 1913 by a man named Noble Drew Ali. He originally was from North Carolina and then migrated to the urban North as a child. And he taught his African American followers they were actually Moorish Americans of Asiatic descent, whose true religion is Islam. The home videos featured El Rukin men sporting the iconic red fezzes traditionally associated with the Moorish Science Temple, while women often wore turbans and other scarf styles. So the home videos captured parties the El Rukins used to hold for the community in their building they purchased, which was located at 3947 South Drexel Avenue in the heart of Southside Chicago. So this building was formerly the Oakland Square Theater. It was built in 1907. And this is like prior to like the advent of the feature motion picture, of course, probably like a decade later. There was some discrimination against Black people at this theater during the earlier days, especially after it was built. However, in looking at the archives from the Chicago Defender newspaper, you see more advertisements for films being screened there. The Defender, of course, being a Black newspaper in Chicago. But you see more advertisements of films being screened there probably about around the 1950s, right? So you see more Black people attending this theater in the around like the 50s and 60s, as well as working at the theater as projectionist, among other things. So when this became El Rukin headquarters, the mosque was like on the first floor, and reportedly parties were held on the second floor. And at these events, Black Muslim families affiliated with the community would bring their kids, families, and friends to, really chill, dance, and eat while donning their red fezzes and attire associated with the Moorish Science Temple. And really, these parties functioned as a safe space for Black people throughout the city and even beyond the El Rukins to congregate. And before becoming El Rukin headquarters, like almost immediately before, this was known as the Afro Arts Theater, as you can see at the top right corner. And the Afro Arts Theater was a landmark site of the Black arts movement in Chicago, where Black radical activists regularly met, spoke, and engaged in artistic expression. So the Afro Arts Theater was shut down as a result of local authorities under the leadership of Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley after a well-publicized speech by Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture. But these home videos are really evidence that this building did not cease to function as a site of liberatory artistic expression, specifically expression of the cinematic in the aftermath of the theater's closing. Thus, it really made sense for the El Rukins to purchase the former Afro Arts Theater as their mosque and headquarters, really solidifying El Rukin resistant cinema as a reflection of the Black arts movement, the Black power movement, and third cinema under the banner of really Blackstone era folklore, as they were previously known as the Blackstone Rangers. So during the era of the El Rukins, the building was initially called the El Rukin Grand Major Temple of the Moorish Science Temple of America. And later it was changed to Masjid al-Malik when they embraced Sunni Islam. But over time, the community casually referred to it as the Fort, really a play on the name of El Rukin and Blackstone Ranger co-founder Jeff Fort. So amidst all of the surveillance, incarceration, and violence at the hands of the state, the El Rukins really found moments of joy through cultivating a cinematic aesthetic via their own folkloric tradition. So in 1988, a television documentary aired on the rise of El Rukin leader Jeff Fort, then known as Abdul Malik Kaba. And it aired on local Chicago television by reporter Carol Marin, titled Angel of Fear. So clearly this was, a representation that very much vilified him on TV. However, there were excerpts of footage of El Rukin families at large gathering in their headquarters that Marin referred to as home movies taken by the El Rukins for the El Rukins. And decades later, an hour-long 1979 El Rukin home video converted from a video cassette tape was uploaded to Chicago's Media Burn Independent Video Archive and entitled El Rukin Home Video Number 1. Eventually, a subsequent half-hour tape was listed under the name of El Rukin Home Video Number 2, and that was also uploaded. Initially, it was not uploaded. However, in the finding aid, it was listed, and I contacted them, and they just went ahead and uploaded it. So these home videos actually have survived into the digital age, and they're often viewed online with joy by followers of various contemporary Moorish Science Temple groups. However, the use of resistance cinema is not something that the El Rukn suddenly began in the late 70s. As I learned during my research visit to Chicago, this has a much larger history, really spanning decades back when they were known as the Blackstone Rangers. Under the leadership of Chairman Fred Hampton in the late 60s, Illinois Black Panther Party once built a close relationship with the Blackstone Rangers. Although prospects of a formal political alliance dissolved upon the death of Hampton, his assassination by the state in 1969, the Blackstone Rangers had long incorporated really elements of Black Chicago's thriving cultural nationalism into their organizational folklore and had been involved in the struggle for self-determination. They marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement when he protested housing discrimination, but also within the traditions of this organization, which eventually became known as the Almighty Black Peacestone Nation. There was the professed goal, quote, to rebuild an independent nation for all Black people, unquote, who had been enslaved and stripped of our African past, the unifying vision that really even encompassed members of rival organizations in this vision. The Blackstone Rangers was co-founded by Jeff Fort, who's sitting in the middle of this photograph, who migrated from rural Mississippi to Chicago with his family around 1955. In 1959, the Blackstone Rangers would be formed along with 15-year-old Eugene Bull Hairston, who's on the right of this picture. So in the mid to late 60s, the headquarters of the Blackstone Rangers was located at the First Presbyterian Church, which is actually an integrated, predominantly white church located in the Woodlawn neighborhood of Chicago. So the Stones would frequently use their gymnasium to host community events. So while I was in Chicago, I would actually explore the First Presbyterian Church records, an extensive collection of nearly like 50 large boxes that have been processed. They were actually processed by a former member of First Presbyterian Church. And what's very interesting is I was given that former member's email address. And whenever I arrived at the Newberry Library, I was informed she was there. So fortunately, I had an ability to, speak with her because she was actually at the First Presbyterian Church or a member of it during a time in which there was a raid by the Chicago Police Department on their safe where they had some weapons being stored. So that was very great to speak with, some living history. She is in her 80s actually, but anyhow, at the height of their program with the First Presbyterian Church, the Stones produced a musical review under the direction of Oscar Brown Jr. titled "Opportunity Please Knock" in 1967, and it really extends from the legacies of like community theater and the Black arts movement. So this performance that you see advertised here took place at the First Presbyterian Church, and many throughout the community, including Muhammad Ali, attended the shows. So while studying the First Presbyterian papers at the Newberry Library, I learned a lot about Opportunity Please Knock and was surprised to find like flyers and an article in which Oscar Brown Jr. described that the Blackstone Rangers are in need of a church that, quote, might branch out into a variety of cultural activities such as dancing, drama, and the like, unquote, while also functioning as, quote, a physical center for their economic, cultural, and spiritual activities, unquote. So this envisions like a proto-cinematic space for the Blackstone Rangers to artistically express themselves, build community, and engage in political organizing. In this instance, discussions of the cinematic are rooted in and discussed alongside Black faith and spirituality. So I came across a pamphlet from November 1967. And this is about a conference hosted by the Blackstone Rangers. And as you can see right here, the topic is From Caste to Black Nation, What is Church Policy to Be? So this featured discussions on Black liberation theology, colonialism, and the Black Power movement with panels such as Maulana Karinga, Albert Cleage, and many others. And as Oscar Brown Jr. once described Blackstone Ranger co-founder Jeff Fort is reminding him of, quote, a very charismatic Black Baptist preacher as a youth presiding over a large organization. Black religion, resistance, media, and revolution were intertwined for the Blackstone Rangers during this time. Additionally, when I went to the Harold Washington Library, I also found a membership card for Jeff Fort in a Baptist church under the leadership of Reverend Clay Evans. The associate pastor was actually Reverend Jesse Jackson, who baptized him, interestingly, in the 1960s. But during my visit to the Newberry Library, I was also able to view multiple budgets for grants the Blackstone Rangers received for programs to be held in the First Presbyterian Church. As you can see right here, some of the grants were used for youth programs focusing on teaching trade skills or cultural programs. But as you can see right here for the Ranger Night School, you see there are films allocated in the budget, as well as like film rentals. And this has led me toward a journey I'm currently on to find film titles. And of course, this is like an oral history journey. So I'm presently researching that. So in exploring representation of the movie theater in literary narratives on the Great Migration, Jacqueline Stewart describes how in Richard Wright's 1940 novel Native Son, the cinema really functioned as a place in which Black people, quote, could escape momentarily the pressures and limitations of everyday life on the South Side of Chicago, unquote. So the cinematic was central to the way in which the Blackstone Rangers constructed themselves. While the name like Blackstone is often credited with having originated from the street Blackstone Avenue in Chicago, some narratives on the origins of the name Ranger are attributed to the 50s television series and film The Lone Ranger. In addition to appropriating and redefining elements from the mainstream cinema, participating in what Stewart calls reconstructive spectatorship, there is also a strong desire, really based on direct experiences, to refute harmful caricatures of Blackness in the U.S. media, specifically, in visual media. And this was seen in a transcript of an address by the Stones from a press conference in which they directly challenged the newspapers, TV, and radio for branding them as being gangbangers, gangsters, and troublemakers, as you can see right here. So in addition to using theatrical productions and press conferences to engage in proto-cinematic discourses, the Stones also produced print media. During my many visits to the Chicago History Museum, where I studied the Woodlawn Organization records, I found copies of a newspaper published by the Blackstone Rangers called Progressive People's Power. As you can see, this is a 1969 edition, the 5th issue in the first volume, and it confronts the oppression of Black poor communities by the city of Chicago. So as you can see on the left, there is also a statement to subscribers that was released with this issue, detailing how many Stones had been imprisoned due to police repression, delaying the publication of their issues in July and August. So seeing the Panthers and Stones as comrades in a struggle for Black liberation against the fascist institution of the police, authorities vilified this revolutionary fervor as mere gang violence. And this was confronted in another Stone newspaper, the Almighty Black Peace Stone, that resembles other earlier issues, really, of the Black Panther newspaper in style and content. This 1970 issue, you can see, is equipped with articles written by members, and it quotes Malcolm X's statement that all Black people have a common enemy regardless of their differences. So as you can see, the front of the paper reads, "Community demands end police repression now," and there is an article characterizing in this, it's not on the screen, but it's really characterizing Black Chicago as an occupied territory that was being terrorized by the authorities who murdered Fred Hampton and recently ransacked both Blackstone Ranger, Black Peace Stone, and Illinois Black Panther offices for police searches. So the Almighty Black Peace Stone newspaper was clearly an intentional effort by the Stones to use forms of media most accessible to their organization to resist dominant narratives in the way society attempted to train them to view themselves. Additionally, very influenced by Chicago's thriving cultural nationalist scene, Jeff Fort would also tell the Stones vivid stories about Africa, often connecting it to their vision and purpose. So in a book on the Almighty Black Peace Stone Nation by Natalie Moore and Lance Williams, they have a quote attributed to him that in which he says, quote, "They had kings who ran the governments, and they had princes who were studying on how to run the governments when their daddies died. They would be kings someday, but they did not make it. They were whipped and tied up and shipped to Alabama to work like dogs. So what we gonna do? We gonna have our own government, the way our daddies did long time back. They don't let us in their government, we get our own. They not let us in, we be out. We be the out boys for the out peoples because we's all princes. And really fast forwarding from the late 1960s quote that I just read to 1979, the home videos showcase El Rukn men, women, and children dressed in the Islamic clothing or the Moorish Science Temple in a fashion that writes their history in a way that really reinforces the glory of Black Stone era folklore under the banner of the Islamic. So, as Ford embraced Islam in prison, he took the name Abdul Malik Kaba, affectionately known as Chief Malik, and changed the name of his organization to the Circle 7 El Rukn Moorish Science Mosque of America after his 1976 parole, adopting the tenets and iconography of the Moorish Science Temple and eventually Sunni Islam. Interestingly, this period also paralleled with the conversion of many Black revolutionaries to Sunni Islam between the 60s and 70s. So, considering the centrality of the cinematic to the history of the Blackstone Rangers, the purchasing of the former Oakland Square Theater and Afro Arts Theater as their mosque and headquarters does not appear to be merely coincidental. In the home videos, the El Rukns created an environment where the Black poor and working class was comfortable enough to experience what Tina Camp refers to in her study of the Black gaze as radical Black joy in a society where Black children are stripped of innocence and referred to as predatory by the hegemonic white gaze. As a result, in some of these home videos, you see many children who were present at the parties would smile at on their faces, also engaging in symbolic gestures of El Rukn and Moorish Science Temple for the camera. And other times you see them tapping into their creative power through the art of dance, aware and unaware. The camera operator pans throughout the room, occasionally focusing on a shot. In El Rukn home video number 2, the Brides of Funkenstein's Disco to Go and Parliament's Bop Gun Endangered Species play back to back. Occasionally, the DJ mixes the siren into the sound. When the music briefly halts for a couple of seconds, an adult can be heard saying, "Uh-oh." As Chief Malik is seen cutting a turkey or a chicken, a child pats him on the back to ask him a question, as though he's someone he respects very much. And another child, as you can see in this, is holding their hand up and giving rhythmic dancing gestures to the camera. And initially, you can't see their face because of the camera's focus largely on the adults at that particular point in time. But the parties in the home video are reminiscent of a traditional African-American family reunion. As you can see right here, you can see like the checkered tablecloth, right? You can see people dancing, people sitting around eating. And among other things. So as contemporary funk music and disco music from artists such as Parliament, Barry White, Chick, A Taste of Honey, and Michael Jackson plays in the background, the men and women dance separately as though it is a family occasion as opposed to like club or date night. Some of the men stand with their arms folded, seriously standing on posts, but occasionally smiling for the camera. One home video actually included the words El Rukn love superimposed over images of El Rukn elders and youth, describing the atmosphere of love in this familial type of environment. So the El Rukns had long been conscious of their representation in the media as gangsters and terrorists. When I arrived at the Vivian Harsh collection of the Carter G. Woodson Library during my Chicago trip, the first folder I opened was titled El Rukn Circle 7 Moorish Science Mosque of America, 1983, in the Leonard Wash papers. To my surprise, I found a flyer for an event hosted by the Circle 7 El Rukn Moorish Science Mosque of America at a park, featuring performances by The Last Poets and addresses by community activists and educators. So as you can see, this has built a unity rally, which also reminds me of the many unity rallies spearheaded by Malcolm X in Harlem during the 1960s. And the handout to the right explains that this is a universal call for community empowerment, focusing on confronting injustice and challenging the representation of El Rukn in the local media. Additionally, it also functioned as a forum to, as it says here, quote, respond to the false and erroneous charges that have been fabricated by corrupt officials and disseminated through the news media in their malicious and diabolical attempt to discredit the Circle 7 El Rukn Moorish Science Mosque of America and other grassroots organizations concerned with the welfare and development of the people, unquote. So this event featuring performances by the last poets, but also speeches by religious scholar and activist Dr. Archie Hargraves, revolutionary imam and former Panther who was based in Los Angeles, Imam Muhammad Abdullah, and an organizer who actually published a book called The Islamic Republic of New Africa by the name of Ahmed Mustafa Shafiq, right? So this cultural, educational, and political programming really provides insight into how El Rukns had an analysis of media industries and sought to directly subvert the media's representations of Black revolutionaries and Muslims, but also involving art via like the last poets, in this process as well. So many scholars of home video, such as Patricia Zimmerman and James Moran, explain how home video was a largely under-theorized and marginalized media in film and video studies. Zimmerman theorizes home video as amateur film that once had the ability to disrupt Hollywood's hegemony in defining film aesthetics by creating a bridge of access to film technology outside of professional settings. Although this did become very complicated with the commodification of the technology in a fashion that really reinforced the capitalist system and bourgeois family values in the marketing of home video technologies. Nevertheless, James Moran argues that the ideologies embedded into the medium are defined by the people who use such technologies in a manner that strengthens themes internal to a tradition of family folklore. So in 1987, Chief Malik and many other El Rukns were sentenced to prison after being charged with conspiring to commit acts of domestic terrorism on behalf of a foreign government to secure a $2.5 million loan for Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. Despite state claims of terrorism, many Black activists would explain how the El Rukns were framed as a result of entrapment, becoming political prisoners as a result of their involvement in the Black liberation struggle, and as Black revolutionary organizers. Given their history of involvement in the Black freedom struggle, the terrorism conviction all too resembles state framings of Panthers and veterans of the Black Liberation Army. During the El Rukn trial, they were portrayed as all around predatory in the local Chicago news cycle, as their use of media was always represented as sinister, including many accusations about their intents in, shooting footage and making videos. And there was a wide denunciation of the El Rukns really as media makers, condemning their existence in the realm of the cinematic. They were even vilified as spectators, as Angel Affair and many other television programs stated they desired to, purchase a law rocket after seeing Clint Eastwood use one in The Enforcer in 1976, part of the Dirty Harry franchise, I think the third sequel. But in line with media sensationalism surrounding the El Rukns in the 80s, the prosecution, to the objection of the defense, would play clips from The Enforcer during the trial. Regardless of whether the El Rukns were media makers or spectators, they were characterized as terroristic brutes in need of destruction by the white supremacist U.S. nation state. As Evelyn Al-Sultani notes, the state solution to the so-called Muslim quote-unquote terrorist threat is, quote, elimination through militarism, incarceration, and war, unquote, things that are all too familiar to Black revolutionaries struggling for freedom, justice, and equality. So during Chief Malik's trial, it was recommended that he wear a suit and tie. However, he decided to remain true to his El Rukn identity and sport a thobe and white kufi. Unlike the more Science Temple attire in the home videos, this outfit was reflective of the group's movement towards Sunni Islam, which was also shaped by the Black radical tradition, as a couple of El Rukns were conscious citizens of the Republic of New Africa and active organizers in the struggle and other formations. Unlike the facility of the fort, the U.S. courtroom is a really dry space that strips away the liveliness of the racialized subject and renders the Black subject incapable of joy, spirituality, or existence. In the streets of urban Black communities in the U.S., Chief Malik's attire is reflective of what Suad Abdul Kabir refers to as the Muslim cool, since it is, quote, legible in the hood, but also upholds a particular interpretation of the Sunnah and thus fulfills a particular desire for piety, unquote. Unlike the transformative power of the fort as well as the cinematic displayed in the fort. In the space of the courtroom, the Black subject is brought down to remember, as Wilderson has theorized, that they are still a slave on a plantation and subject to the chains of whiteness. On June 6, 1990, Masjid al-Malik was demolished by a quote, rusty 6,000-pound wrecking ball, unquote, from the Chicago Tribune, as after having been seized by the city of Chicago in 1989. State representatives collected remains, as you can see in this photograph, from the Arukins' home as relics, rejoicing over the Black poor and working class being displaced from Chicago's Woodlawn community and pipelined through the prison industrial complex. Is this what becomes of Black radical joy? And also in the archive, I saw in the finding aid, I actually did not go look at this, but there actually was listed a brick in the finding aid for a Chicago officials archives that he donated from this building. So then this brings into conversation narratives as well as violence of the archives, you know, how the archives execute anti-Blackness and participate in Black oppression. And it also made me think about, you know, the notion of, I know there's a recent book by Orasami Burton on the Attica struggle called Tip of the Spear, where he discusses engaging in an archival war, right? You know, really using the state's archives against itself, but also relying on personal archives people have gathered over time. And lastly, in conclusion, I do want to mention the home videos. So I actually discovered the home videos a long time ago, over like 10 years ago, because they had been on the internet, right? There are various pages as, you know, someone who's Muslim, but also studies Islam in Black America. I know it's on some Moorish science pages on like Facebook. There were excerpts of these videos actually shared. And as I mentioned, the videos were uploaded by the Media Burn Independent Video Archive. When I was in Chicago, I actually sent them an email because I wanted to know exactly how they got the videos, right? And I wanted to go to look at maybe some of the intake records or appraisal records to see the history of these videos. Interestingly, I mentioned the documentary Angel of Fear on the website. It says they belong to the Carol Marin records who made that documentary, which was strange because I wanted to know like how did she gain access to it? So I sent an email to them hoping to maybe go to the archive, but they said they didn't have many records. They just had the labels on the home videos, which they took photos and sent to me. However, they said that the narrative that I was given, and I want to also interview other people to understand maybe more about the history of this, but the archive told me that they believe, quote unquote, that the tapes were given to her and she made copies of them, which also I have my questions about that particular story or narrative. So I'm presently in the process of doing more research. I do plan to return to Chicago to gather more oral histories, as well as go through some more of the boxes at the Newberry Library. As I mentioned, there are nearly 50 large boxes, not even like smaller ones, that are all full of material from the First Presbyterian Church on their history, but also a significant amount on the Black Stone Rangers and their program, really with the Black Stone Rangers throughout the 1960s and even some 1970s material, and even materials that also mention things associated with Islam at this same point in time. But thank you all, and I look forward to the questions and answers.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here, Cam. It's so wonderful to engage your work. It's also really cool to see you using some of the exact same materials and collections I used when I was a BMRC fellow. In some ways, our research is really different, and yet it's so clear that it intersects in many ways. So you're enriching my own research and knowledge, even as I'm excited to be discovering more about yours. Um, I wanted to ask, let's maybe start with thinking about how you regard this cinematic work that you have been uncovering in Chicago as an extension of or departure from the Black arts movement in the city and the Blackstone Rangers connection with it.
Yes, yeah, so I definitely see it as really an extension of the work of the Black arts movement, right? If we look at some of the Black arts manifestos by people like Amiri Baraka or even Larry Neal, we see there is a deliberate desire to make art that really is in line with the struggle, that has some type of political purpose that advances, the Black struggle. So I think that this is very much in line with that, as we saw through many of the archives, especially the one of the last ones I shared regarding the Operation Grassroots Unity rally that they held at Drexel Park in Chicago. We see a strong intertwining of really Black political thought with art, right? And this is being a larger part of resistant cinema as well, right? Resistant cinema really being embedded with notions of Black resistance as well as revolution, right? Really firmly in line with the Black arts movement, but also the Black radical tradition. And one other thing that I want to mention about this is that, I place the El Rukin home videos in dialogue with theorists of third cinema, right? So sometimes first cinema is considered cinema connected to Hollywood, like this major oppressive institutional apparatus, whereas second cinema, some people theorize of this as really entailing, like art films, independent film, but independent film with a notion of ultimately like maybe assimilating into the standards of mainstream cinema in terms of form, style, etc., or maybe ultimately making films aiming to gain an opportunity to really enter Hollywood in like the mainstream realm, whereas third cinema is usually defined as something that just really seeks to be outside of the system, not assimilate within the system. I think this is very, as Black studies scholars, the notion of Black studies as anti-disciplinary. I think the form of third cinema can kind of be, attached to that in many ways. So I look at, of course, the Arukan home videos are not videos or cinematic productions that are shot for gain, and they are also very spontaneous, in many ways as well, right? However, they are also connected to really a larger tradition, a larger like Black radical tradition as well. So yes, I see third cinema kind of intersecting with the Black arts movement whenever thinking about and considering the home videos.
That's really interesting. And that also segues nicely into another of the questions that I had. And I'll ask this one, and then I will open things up for our community to engage and ask questions. So please be thinking of what you would like to ask or know. But you mentioned briefly the notion of a Cineland as part of that kind of third cinema space or creating some alternate world of filmic production. Could you say more about like developing a notion of a kind of African American Muslim Cineland and how that is taking shape as you're tracking down and recovering and exploring these different films and the kinds of cultural activities attached to them?
Yes, and thank you so much for your great questions. I really appreciate it. It has me thinking of my research in various different ways. So interestingly, whenever I went to Chicago, of course, I did plan to research the El Home videos. That was my primary objective, as well as the history of like the Black Stone Rangers. So actually on my first day, many of the archives that I planned to visit were didn't open until I got there on a Sunday, right? I actually drove from Georgia to Chicago. I got there Sunday evening, and on Monday, many of these institutions actually were closed. I frequented the Chicago History Museum and the Newberry Library all throughout my trip, and those don't open until like Tuesday, I think. So I'm actually working on a separate project called Islam in the LA Rebellion Film Movement. It's an article I'm drafting right now. And for those who don't know, the LA Rebellion Film Movement was a group of Black filmmakers who were educated at UCLA School of Film and Theater, right? They were initially part of something called the Ethno Communications Program, really to like trigger integration, during that era. So this was between the 60s and like the 80s, and many of them sought to resist like the studio system influenced by Black arts movement, influenced by third cinema, among various other like revolutionary movements as well, anti-colonial struggles. So I went to this Film Study Center researching that on my first day there. And very interestingly, prior to going to Chicago, there's actually a film called Akbar in Cineland, which was made in 1969, and it really it's an experimental film, 30 minutes long, focuses on a film student by the name of Ahmed Akbar, and it's almost like a essay of sorts, right? In that he's on like a large piece of land, right, and he's describing his vision for like what he refers to as a quote unquote cine land, right, and in this cine land he looks at this as a space in which Black cinema can be made outside of the system and against the system, but also as a place where he feels that Black poor and working class people can come, almost as like a land of liberation. So in many ways, whenever I came to Chicago, I was thinking about this, right? Because there's also a film, Larry Clark, who's a director in the LA Rebellion film movement. He directed a film about that actually takes place in Chicago in '73 called As Above, So Below, which is really about urban guerrilla warfare. '73 is also the year The Spook Who Sat by the Door came out. But at any rate, he was strongly inspired by Akbar's work. In an oral history interview, he said, that this was a very influential film for them in the class as the LA Rebellion film movement. So interestingly, I can see the El Rukns is creating very much something that Akbar described in Akbar and Cineland, really a space, as I mentioned, Oscar Brown Jr.'s quotes about getting this Blackstone Rangers a church, right? To not only function as a place for artistic development, but also, a place for support, right? A place where they could also engage in activism. And lastly, on this point, since I mentioned Larry Clark's film that takes place actually in Chicago, Clark is initially from Cleveland. He got his start taking photographs of two groups in Cleveland called the Afro Set Party for Self-Defense, as well as the Republic of New Libya, right? Republic of New Libya engaged in a shootout with the police in 1968 in Cleveland, Ohio. And interestingly, Ahmed, there was a man named Ahmed, a separate Ahmed. His name was Ahmed Evans. He started the Republic of New Libya, and he actually was Muslim as well. And very interestingly, when I went to Chicago, I actually found, in the Leonard Wash papers where I found like the flyers for the El Rukn event at Drexel Park, also like a newspaper called The New African, published by the Republic of New Africa. And as you can see, like right here, they actually had like an ad to free Ahmed Evans, right? Listed in the paper. But, just kind of like, cross influence across the Midwest, Chicago/Cleveland, but also, just kind of drawing back to your question, like this notion of a cine land and really how this was something that really transcended regions whenever it came to Black cinema of the 60s and 70s.
Thank you for that. And it's really interesting to think about the different kinds of geographic reach of that Cineland now that those videos are online and you're telling me that they, you mentioned that they are being watched and really widely enjoyed. So thank you for that. So I would love to open it up to the group. If you have any questions, please feel free either to raise your hand or if you would rather drop a question in the chat, you are welcome to do so. Tassif, yes, please go ahead.
Yep. Assalamu alaikum. It was an excellent presentation. It was very coherent and a very interesting sampling of the work that Dr. Kem is working on. The question that's persistently on my mind is how can the framing of Chief Malik, Imam Abdul Malik Kaba, aka Jeff Fort, and the El Rukns as a so-called street gang and an alleged terrorist organization by the government and the media apparatus be understood in a context of contemporary social movements, and what parallels can be drawn between their struggles for Black empowerment through art and activism and today's efforts by marginalized communities to resist systemic oppression and create cultural change. It's kind of broad in that regard, but it's something that was like in the back of my mind, like when looking at the archival data and materials and, seeing like contemporary movements.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a great question. I really appreciate it. Yes. So, of course, Chief Malik is still in prison, right? Incarcerated. And of course, today we have many political prisoners affiliated with really the Black Power movement, especially, as well as, other movements like American Indian movement, among other movements fighting for liberation in this country. And with political prisoners, this notion of like taking them off of the street, and there's also this notion of like erasure of these legacies, right? As well as really a form of using media. I know in the 80s Ed Guerrero refers to a lot of 80s films as recuperative cinema, right? Of course in the 1980s there's a strong pushback against like the civil rights and Black Power movement. On a very cinematic level, you have the growth of like the interracial buddy cop film, right? That really functions to usher in the notion of a post-racial society as well. So you have all of these, mainstream media apparatuses really seeking to kind of tone out like this notion of a resistant cinema, right? Of course, today, whenever we think of participatory media, which home video, a form of participatory media in among other outlets like public access TV, we see like a growth of participatory media in terms of the web, right? If we think of the various video sharing platforms, right? Like on the web. So, I think El Rukin home videos, obviously, home video was something made for the private sphere, right? Something perhaps not intended to circulate like among the public, right? So in contemporary times, this is also something I'm very interested in exploring insofar as how, media also is deployed as a form of resistance, right? Like on, vlogging websites, for instance, you have cinematic counter narratives being made in terms of during like uprisings, like the Ferguson uprising, right? Or even in Baltimore with the murder of like Freddie Gray. You have various various participants in these media discourses really using their technologies in order to maybe like film the police, film them being surveilled, right? You know, a form of what I believe Simone Brown refers to as dark surveillance, right? Directly responding, you know, really a form of resistance cinema. And I would steep this very much in, I know in Garrett Felber's book, he talks about how Malcolm X during like trials against Muslims and members of the Nation of Islam who were politically imprisoned, he actually would take the camera and take pictures of some of those who were charged, right, with crimes in order to humanize the defendants, right? So you have Malcolm X using the camera as a form of resistance in a similar way that we could say the Arukans have used the camera, but also we can say, Black media makers on the web, right, using video sharing platforms and social media have done, right? So, also on a last note, I know I talked about the LA Rebellion film movement as well as how they specifically sought to resist the studio system and state violence. There's a film directed by Haile Garima called Bush Mama, released in 1979. And at the beginning of the film, you actually see a Black man being really brutalized and harassed like by the police, and that actually was something that happened in real life, right? This was the director. The police did not feel comfortable seeing a Black man with the camera and started harassing the director during the screening of the film, right? So you have these various forms of resistance, the use of a camera, you know, as a form of resistance and as a form of, you know, recording events as it actually happened, right? As somewhat, I would say, somewhat of a safety apparatus, right? Even though it's important not to be naive, right? Because living as a Black person in this society, not even a camera can really save you from the brutality or prevent Black death, right? So I think this is a very interesting question. This project actually focuses on the pre-9/11 era. However, I am presently doing work to just really kind of understand more about how these traditions are continued, ranging from home video to really the digital age. So thank you for your question, Tausif. I hope I answered parts of it in meaningful ways.
Shukran.
Thank you for that question and answer. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, please go ahead.
So much, Cam. It's really a pleasure to see this work, especially because it puts a lot of things coming together. As someone who did grow up thinking, hearing the El Rukns and Blackstone Raiders referred to only as a game, that's quite interesting. I wonder, I know I saw you here this summer, this trajectory of where people are now, like what's the legacy? And I actually last night went to see the film, the Murder Fred Hampton video that Chicago Film Archive was showing. And seeing some of your images there, especially the image of them demolishing, the happiness of the demolishment of their structures, it looks like the happiness of the Chicago police officers. They carry Fred Hampton's body out of that, and their smile and their joy on their faces. And so there's a lot of things you can see. But what's the legacy? Like, what do we see these communities? Where are they now? Like, what do we see in modern day Chicago or outside of Chicago? There's these coordinated attempts to destroy these communities, and so what do we see now? Sorry.
Yes, in terms of like maybe tracing a trajectory of these communities from then until now. So really in Chicago, there actually was a masjid in Chicago. I'm blanking on the name, maybe Masjid Al-Kaaba, that was located in the south side of Chicago. I believe it was on Cottage Grove. I wanted to, as a Muslim, I wanted to visit that mosque very much. However, I noticed it had been closed, but it was closed, and no longer there. But I believe, this was fairly recent. I think it I think it was open probably like 5 years ago, right? So we see the legacies there. Also, there's a documentary called The Interrupters, which is really on violence interrupters in Chicago, starring Jeff Ford, or Chief Malik's daughter, Amina Matthews. And in that, she actually goes to Juma in the documentary at a mosque where her husband is the imam, right? And that mosque is Masjid Al Hafiz. So, you can see maybe some of the focus on like social activism, right? In terms of the community kind of embedded there as well. What's very interesting as well is, of course, in Chicago, Chicago is known as also the headquarters of the Nation of Islam, right, on South Stony Island Avenue. So what's interesting is that back in the day, in the 80s, some El Rukns were invited to Savior's Day event, right? So there was a connection there, even though different organizations, different movements, right? It's interesting to see intersections with other movements, as well as other Muslim movements that aren't based in Chicago as well. There was, some communication as well as mentoring by other Black Sunni Jamaats throughout, the United States. Yes. Yeah, yeah. So yes, and I'd be happy to talk with. Be happy to talk with you more about this. If you would like to, meet and discuss it. So
Sure. Thanks so much. Thank you so much. Can't wait to see the book.
yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again, Dr. Copeland, and you as well, Dr. Gordon. And we are just a couple minutes over. And I just do want to remind everyone that the summer short-term fellowship for summer of 25, the application period is open, and you are invited to apply or certainly share the information. We thank you for joining us today. I put a little QR code on the screen, but of course, all the information is on our website. Again, Dr. Copeland, be sure to stay in touch with us.
Yeah.
We are excited about your work and look forward to, as Samaya said, really do look forward to your book. And if there's more that we can do to assist, you let us know.
Yes. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And then thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.